Silence of. All right, here we go. Welcome to the afternoon session of the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs here on Groundhog Day. We are here to pick up our work on H127, and our first witness today is Dean Hesterman. So, Dean, would you please introduce yourself and your role for the record?
Good afternoon. I'm Dean Hesterman, Vice President of Issues Management and Strategic Communications for Caesars Entertainment.
I appreciate you joining us today, and please give us your perspective on H127.
I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and good afternoon. The foundation of my remarks is Caesars' 80 years of experience managing resort casinos, mobile sports books, and other gaming facilities across a wide array of operating models, regulatory frameworks, and tax structures. Our position on responsible gaming is simple and unequivocal. We want everyone who gambles to do so for the right reasons, to simply have fun. We don't want people who don't gamble responsibly to play with us or with any other operator. Those goals drive all of the programs we have developed to promote responsible gaming over the past 35 years, and they're consistently applied across all the forms of gambling that we offer. I applaud H127 for its emphasis on consumer protection, and in particular, its enlightened approach to responsible gaming. I'm going to highlight a few of those components in my remarks today, but by and large, the approach to RG in H127 represents best practices in sports betting legislation consistent with its implementation now in more than 30 states. As Vermont considers how best to address problem gambling and responsible gaming, I thought it might be useful to highlight the principles that underlie what's known as the Reno model. This is a strategic framework that several leading scholars developed in the early 2000s to guide all stakeholders, industry, mental health providers, community groups, consumers, governments, and regulators on responsible gaming. According to the Reno model, all stakeholders have roles to play. Now, some of these roles are unique to one stakeholder group or another, but there's much shared responsibility. And I hope Vermont will view responsible gaming as a partnership where all stakeholders work toward our mutual goal of reducing the prevalence and cost of gambling disorders. Caesars' own approach to responsible gaming was heavily influenced by this model. It's an integrated approach to RG based on clear objectives, measurable outcomes, and scientific research and evidence. Staff training and state-of-the-art purpose-built IT systems support these initiatives. Now, foundational to RG policy, according to the Reno model, is informed choice. The ultimate decision to gamble resides with the individual. And to properly make this choice, individuals must have the opportunity to be informed. So let's dig into the Reno model just a bit. According to the Reno model, a comprehensive responsible gaming ecosystem has three components. The first is education and consumer awareness. This means communication campaigns encouraging responsible gaming both within gambling venues and on gambling apps, as well as in the community. These campaigns cover topics like limit setting for spending both time and money, as well as information on how to identify a problem and where to get help. It's encouraging that H127 covers in-app responsible gaming messaging, and that the Problem Gambling Fund's purview specifically requires education and awareness programs related to problem gambling. I think that provision of H127 might be improved, though, by an explicit charge to develop and implement prevention programs as well. We would encourage the state to recognize the importance of educating and cultivating the informed consumer, who we all hope will never develop a problem. We make significant investments ourselves in strategically placed RG messaging to reach consumers. We became the first company to broadcast RG-themed ads in 2002 when we aired them in conjunction with National World Series of Poker TV broadcasts. More recently, because of their credibility and popularity among football fans, we partnered with football's legendary Manning family on national and regional ads dedicated to increasing knowledge about the RG tools on our Caesars Sportsbook app, as well as providing visibility to the National Problem Gambling Helpline. We spent $4.5 million to air the Manning spot between the fall of 2021 and December 2022, which garnered 96 million viewer impressions. Similar spots continue to be broadcast and run digitally. The second Reno model component is the responsible provision of gambling. This includes providing RG training to gaming operator staff, socially responsible advertising and promotions, and offering meaningful alternatives for assistance to customers, such as self-exclusion. H127 likewise emphasizes these provisions. I was especially pleased to see text in the bill requiring resources to be made available to bettors expressing concerns about problem gambling. Caesars recognizes the opportunity we have in helping customers address their problems. All team members are trained to listen for and empowered to report things they hear or read that cause them concern about a customer's gambling. This program has been implemented both in our brick and mortar facilities as well as digitally. We provide advanced training to team members at a supervisory level. These are known as responsible gaming ambassadors, who are trained to have conversations with guests who express that gambling may be causing them problems. And we will, on occasion, deny a customer's play privileges at our own discretion. One modification I might suggest with respect to the responsible provision of gambling services is for the Vermont regulator to administer self-exclusion statewide, such that someone who self-bans from betting with one sports betting provider is banned from betting with all sports betting providers. This would be consistent with self-exclusion administration in virtually every U.S. jurisdiction across the casino, internet gambling, and sports betting sectors. And the third Reno model component is support services and community resources for those experiencing problems, such as telephone and web-based assistance, and ensuring that a network of trained counselors and health providers is available and affordable for those who experience problems. These are, again, all components addressed in H127. Here, I would add only a required evaluation component to the efforts that you envision, to determine that services are reaching the people for whom they are targeted and that those programs are effective. And just a couple final thoughts. One component of the bill that seems to run counter to the Reno Models Council is the provisions in which the state or operator would establish wager limits for customers. No jurisdiction in North America that I'm aware of has such limits in place. In the 1990s, a couple of casino states did have bet and or loss limits. But over time, because those weren't seen as effective in combating problem gambling, they were abandoned. This is not to say that we shouldn't encourage customers to set and stick to limits they set and provide them the tools to do so. Just that having a state or a gambling provider set those limits for customers may not be effective. And I think it's inconsistent with respect for a customer's own agency in decisions on how to spend their time and money. And last, I would caution against establishing 18 as the minimum age to place a sports bet. Almost uniformly, governments across the nation have determined that 21 is the appropriate minimum age. And while I recognize that the states are laboratories for democracy, I hope Vermont would respect that precedent and prevent confusion among young people related to mixed messages. I personally believe that the long-term legitimacy and growth of the sports betting industry hinges on the collective response of all stakeholders to those customers who, for whatever reasons, don't experience our products and services the way that we intend them to be experienced. I thank the sponsors of H127 for their focus on and approach to responsible gaming. And I pledge Caesar's support in ensuring the development of a socially responsible sports betting industry in Vermont. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thanks, Mr. Hesterman, for your testimony. Does anybody on the committee have any questions for Mr. Hesterman? We're going to be hearing from folks from the Department of Mental Health and other experts, but I think because of some scheduling challenges, there's the order that we're going in today was a little bit determined by folks' availability. Great. Well, thank you very much. I don't see any hands up around the room. I think you gave us some very clear suggestions and things to think about. Thanks for being with us today.
Great. Thank you.
So next on our witness list is Dr. Jim Whalen. Could you introduce yourself for the record, please?
Yes, certainly. I'm Jim Whalen. I am a psychologist. I'm also a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Memphis, where I also am the executive director for the Institute of Gambling Education and Research. I probably should add that, I just want to make sure I add that as far as funding goes, I received substantial funding actually from the state of Tennessee. I'm really, in fact, our institute is very much involved in our state in both public awareness as well as coordinating interventions. I am not here being funded by any other group. Dean left, but I was going to say Dean does owe me dinner, but it's not related. Not related to this at all. Oh, he owes me dinner though.
Great. Well, given your experience, we would appreciate your feedback. Our committee, just for context for everyone, I should have set this up a couple days ago, actually, heard the language presented for the first time at H127. So we've done a pretty thorough walkthrough, and this is our first real opportunity to delve into testimony from experts, folks from state agencies, and we'll be, it's my intention, I think the committee's intention, to hear a lot of different perspectives on aspects of the bill. And today we're focused on an introduction to some perspectives on problem gaming.
Shall I go?
Yes, please.
All right,
please give us your perspective.
All right, I'll give you my perspective. And I'm going to start with the fact that, all of us that are on this panel have known each other for years and have worked together and cooperated and asked questions to make sure that we're creating the appropriate safety nets for people. What I thought I might do, being that, I read the bill and I agree. Dean's suggestions, he's a smart guy. His suggestions are on point. And I think you're going to find that, I think you'll find the others presenting today being in 100% agreement with those recommendations. They're just good. One of the things I wanted to do, because I actually read through the bill, I also last night sat around reading press in Vermont and what's been talked about in Vermont. And I'm aware what's been talked about other areas as sports wagering gets developed. And I thought my comment, I'm just going to try to be brief, but realize I do lecture for a living. So just yell at me if you need to. But I'm going to try to be brief and then be available for questions. But I really want to start with the idea of clarifying some terminology here. And in order to be brief, I'm going to look at my notes a little bit. First is the idea of gambling harms. Gambling harms is a descriptor that captures a very wide range of problems and struggles that someone might experience due to their participation in gambling. I kind of use it as I kind of think of it as riding a bike as an analogy for this. When you're riding a bike, your harms can range from anything from being in an accident with a car to having a flat tire. And when we're talking about gambling, it ranges also from an individual who's realized harm and contemplates suicide, all the way to somebody who's had a bad day betting. So those harms exist along a continuum. And responsible gaming is or gambling, as I refer to it, is really about addressing that scope. To break down that scope a little bit for you, I actually chunk them into three sort of categories. You can think of them as on a continuum, but they are a little bit discrete. At one end is gambling disorder, and gambling disorder is the recognized diagnosis in the U.S., psychiatric diagnosis. It is a term used to describe the distress and behavior of a person who's experiencing debilitating and persistent problems related to excessive gambling. So they're doing it excessively, and they're continuing to realize harms in an escalating way. And the best prevalence studies over time has shown two things that are important to realize. I'll put up one finger at a time, but one is that the rate is about 1 or 2%. The second thing to realize is that's pretty stable. Now, lots of people speculate that sports wagering is going to blow up that number, but the best data to date doesn't show that it does. Those people who meet diagnostic criterion remain about the same. Second term is another group that RG, or responsible gambling, needs to address are problem gamblers. These may be those people who are experiencing some problem, but its persistence may not be all that evident, and that harm may exist at what as a psychologist I refer as subclinical, but it's sort of like it's a problem, but it comes and goes for the most part, or it comes for a while and disappears. And this seems to be about 3 to 5% of the population fall into this category. So to separate people who have a diagnosed gambling problem or gambling disorder, and using my bike metaphor, it's sort of like the bike is completely rusted, the tires are rotten, and the chain's broken. Those people need really resources. The second group are people who, the brake is kind of rubbing on the wheel, can't seem to get it not to stop, or it's comes and goes. The tires need air, the chain comes off the chain ring. But again, a very different level of intensity and persistence of a problem. And then the third category are people who I think have a periodic distress. And I think in our clinic right now, we're seeing a lot of sports gamblers experience that, where they go through a month or so and they just did stupid things. And so then they may be turning, some portion of them will turn to us and say, what am I doing wrong? And that's where we're finding educational awareness, helping them come up with a plan for how they're going to wager in the future becomes important, because the sports wagering might be new to them. When we talk about to go back out, when we talk about responsible gambling, we're really talking about the need to think about what each of these groups need and what are the shared responsibilities. So Dean, again, referred to the Reno model and responsible gambling, which is the model we all believe in. And it's evolved a little bit, but it's really a smart document. And I wanted to bring into scope a few critical features as your state begins to engage in responsible gambling. I think the number one thing is that it's a partnership. It's a partnership between regulators, yourselves, and the regulatory board in Vermont, who might be overseeing it and developing the rules and regulations, with the gambling operators that you license in your state, as well as health service providers and educational efforts, et cetera, et cetera. It's a partnership of all of us to create some continuity of care for people. And as I know you guys know as legislators more than most of us citizens do, it's for the protection of the public. And that's why you would engage and invest in it. A couple of things I agree with, I'm going to couple of points to make related to this. One is, in addition to agreeing with Dean, that idea of the stakeholders is really important. It's essential to create that partnership and to have a level of trust. I mean, I've seen people where, I mean, even in state, Tennessee has been very open to a large number of operators, and there's some mistrust there between regulators and operators, and not a level of communication that can effectively work through those easily. That when doing this, that the bill contains, my second point is that the bill contains what I think is a great substructure for building a responsible gaming program. But that what is really important is the next step as you guys go beyond this. And that is to pay attention and make sure that the appropriate people are creating those rules and regulations. I've seen a bunch of states, and those who follow me will detail this more, but states who move forward where the bill looks good, but when it gets to rules and regulations, they're not people who are knowledgeable about this space and knowledgeable about what the literature says, what the research knows, what are the best practices, and all those really have to be built into the, not just the substructure, but to the building itself. It's the realization that different groups, as I laid out those different groups earlier, that the harm reduction for these people is going to be different based on who they are. 1 or 2% are going to need a system of people that can be directly referred to, and that your operators are aware of what they are, that your regulators have a mechanism to directly refer people to treatment. Because we know that if there's a highway from recognition of a problem to getting people to treatment, it helps a lot. But then the other programs, which I'll like and go back to my metaphor, I think about building bike lanes and teaching classes to kids about bike safety, having repair stands periodically on the road that other people may need on that continuum of care, may need those sorts of resources. So be aware that this initiative that's built into the law does have to be carried through to make sure that as your Department of Mental Health deals with how to spend those monies, that a comprehensive differentiated plan is in place. My next point would be choose your partners wisely. I don't know about you guys. I initially get really respond. I love when somebody's selling me something and they're saying this is the best thing since sliced bread. I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds great. I'd love to do that. But fortunately, I got part of my brain that has a pretty good governor on it. And then I stop and I pedal back and I take a look and I see, is this just a performance in front of me, or is this substantiated? Do my operators, in your case, since you're wanting to license just a few operators, do my operators have that tradition? Do they have the infrastructure to actually do RG in a way that works with the state and protects the citizen? And finally, my last point would be funding. I looked at a document. There's a document that comes out every several years that talks about funding in different states and how the monies are used. One of the things that's important is that the funding is consistent. You know, I think about it again. You know, you think about it as a bike. I mean, in a month or so here in Tennessee, I'll be able to get on my bike, and it's that I got to reliably invest in it if I want it to continue to perform effectively. And that I consider it as something that it's just the maintenance I need to do. And so as you think about funding, the idea that the Department of Mental Health has some reliable perspective to think from year to year, how do they build something? That's been my big push in Tennessee is let's think about, when I talk to the state, I talk to the state and to our advisor, the Sports Wagering Council, about not what are we doing this year, but where are we going in the next 5 years? What's our objective in 5 years? How do we want to roll those out? How do we sustain them? Those sorts of issues. And so when you think about the funding portion of it, I think the bill, and it depends on what the rules and regs end up, but the bill seems a little wishy-washy about the funding. And I would say these are money that's coming directly from the proceeds of sports wagering. It's not, And I know legislators, it's a hard, I would not want your job at deciding where to put money, but this is money that's coming in right from sports wagering. So go ahead and make a dedication so that you are protecting the citizens, as I know you want to do. So there are my comments for today. I'm welcome to any questions now or at any other time.
Representative Byron.
I think I have a quick and simple question for you. When you were breaking down the three different definitions, gambling disorder, problem gamblers, periodic distress, you didn't put a percentage of players on periodic distress. You noted 1 to 2% on gaming disorder, 3+, 4+.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's one that waxes and wanes. So if you take a look at the literature on what happens in a community when they build a casino, you see that in the first couple of years of a casino, the rate of people expressing harms climbs a little bit. And then interestingly, almost drops below the pre-casino level. I think of it as sort of, again, I'll use the bicycle metaphor. When you first ride a bike, you're going to fall off a few times, and so those people that have some periodic harm, they may be falling off the bike. And I don't mean to simplify it to say, oh, you're going to learn how to gamble, but that dream of what's going to happen when you gamble will become more rational. It will be less of a shiny object. And you'll see some of the third category of those who just struggle sort of go away. They won't disappear. It's just like everything else in life. Things happen in our lives and sometimes we have problems. But I think those people, by public awareness, by giving them tools, by helping them learn how to use those tools, they can mitigate those pretty quickly and hopefully maybe eliminate them from their lives. So I don't have a number because there is no number that's out there.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Nugent. So, and just for the committee, we have a number of witnesses that have a broad spectrum of expertise. So I want to try to keep the questions really concise and not get broad into discussion, really clarify and stick to what people are testifying about in each section. So just wanted to frame that up. So go ahead, Representative Nugent.
I was just wondering, do you have a sense of the percentage of people who gamble who are, different demographics, might be low socioeconomic, that kind of thing?
Oh, yeah. There is a real need to pay attention to people who have less financial means. The literature is really clear. And, obviously that ends up to be populations that tend to be somewhat underserved in general. But when you're looking at impoverished communities, that's where your efforts really need to be. And it's not clear yet how sports wagering impacts those people who would be part of those communities. One of the things is they have to have a smartphone that they have access to. I mean, that's actually an interesting safeguard. No one's published about that at all, so I don't really know if anyone's asked that question. But I know we've been treating gamblers for 20 years, and a portion of our gamblers, because at one point in time we were doing our homework assignments through an app, and we found out that there was a percentage of our clients that couldn't do that. They just didn't have access to those things. But it also means they're the people who need education, predominantly around how to use their money. One of the things for people who are economically disadvantaged is that the prizes kind of mean more. One of the ways gambling is different from other addictions is no one goes out drinking one night thinking they're going to wake up tomorrow and all their problems are going to be solved. Gamblers do all the time. Every once in a while I'll buy a Mega Millions or Powerball ticket just for the fun conversation with my wife of what would we do if we had all that money. Of course, my wife wants to give it all away, but I have some other ideas. But people, that hope and that dream is part of why people gamble. And when you're financially in a bad spot, the idea of winning $100 or $200 is really much more meaningful than if you're making, $100,000. $100 might not mean very much to you at all. So that's an audience to pay attention to and do awareness campaigns with.
Thank you, Dr. Whalen. Feel free to stick around in the Zoom room. And I think we're going to move on to our next witness. Next, I have Brianne Dora Schwal. Thanks for joining us. I think you're coming from the National Council on Problem Gambling, and I'm noting that we have a couple of folks from your organization. So I just want to make sure if anybody's doing dual testimony, if I should adjust my agenda here as the chair.
Well, thank you. And thank you for noting that. Yes, you have Keith White, the executive director from NCPG. So I'd be happy to take a seat back and let him go first. I think we've broken up the testimony mainly by the problem gambling aspect and then the responsible gaming aspect. My background is I've been intimately involved in the sports wagering policies around the globe in 24 countries now, and in 30 plus of the states that have legalized since 2018. I have done this presentation a couple of times for Vermont. It's an incredible feeling having read your bill to see some of the recommendations from NCPG incorporated. So I will defer to you if you'd like me to go first and continue on about the RG aspects, some problem gambling, or if you'd like to hear from Keith first, more in the, look at Keith, he's like, please no, but it's up to you.
I want to pause for just a moment and defer to Dr. Klein from the Department of Mental Health, because I may have gotten things a little bit out of order.
I think this makes perfect sense how it is, because I'm speaking more to problem gambling as well, and I'll do a little bit about responsible gaming, and that'll lead Keith into what he's talking about most likely.
Okay, great. So I really appreciate everybody helping me a little bit. So Brianne, please take it away, and then we'll have Dr. Klein, and then Keith, I'll call you up after that. So thanks.
Keith gets to close this out. No, I was asked to present a deck that I had presented to the study committee a couple of months ago. Is it okay if I share my screen?
The committee, so our practice here is that the committee all have devices. So I'll direct you to look under Brianne's name. I have the deck up on my device. I think most of us do. So we'll get the committee oriented there if they're not already. And that way we can all see each other, because if you present, then you disappear on us.
I go away. Yeah, I know. I mean, that's fine. Whatever works best for you. Again, my name is Brianne Dora Schwal, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being here on behalf of the National Council on Problem Gambling. NCPG is the national advocate for programs and services to assist problem gamblers and their families. I think it's really important to note that we are neutral on legalized gambling. And as I said earlier, I've had the pleasure of working in over 30 plus states on policies relating to the legalization of sports wagering. And as many of you may know, the current sports betting lay of the land is vast, with Massachusetts just going live 2 days ago. So now we have 33 states, DC and Puerto Rico. Now I bring this up not, you all understand the scope of what's going on, but I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that several states have actually, after legalization, had to go back and address concerns around problem and responsible gambling, because they didn't feel as though it was adequately addressed or didn't realize it at the time of legalization. Colorado, being one of the most notable, just this past year had to pass a standalone responsible gambling bill to increase the funding mechanism for programs and services. They also backed down the amount of tax deductions that were allowed for the promos, because there was many concerns from consumers about just the massive infiltration on their airwaves and on billboards and on push notifications of apps that quickly happened after operations. I'm happy to talk more about that during Q&A if you like, about what else I'm seeing trend-wise. But where do things stand right now? I think it's really important, as Dr. Whelan noted, there is some literature that suggests that anytime you introduce a new form of gambling, you so too will increase the number of problems. And I think having an understanding of the level set of where you are, the survey he referenced out in 2021, put out by NAIADIGS, suggests that there's an estimated 11,629 individuals, or adults in Vermont that are currently struggling. That's roughly about 2.2% of your population. And your current investment per capita ranks you at 26 out of 42. So not exactly great. So the fact that I am seeing a funding mechanism with a floor is really remarkable and something to be proud of, because you are going to need additional funds if you were to legalize. One of the questions that was asked earlier of Dr. Whelan was, what about the demographics? Who struggles more? And the thing that we're learning about sports wagering is it's really flipped those that we consider vulnerable or at risk on its head, comparative to other forms of gambling. And NCPG has this survey, Engage, or the National Survey on Gambling Attitudes and Experiences. It really focused on just the sports bettor and the fantasy player. It was a large-scale survey of close to 30,000 individuals. And I think there's two really important components that we learned. The first is that the majority of individuals felt as though the government should be doing more to help people with an addiction. Again, I'd just like to say that this really supports what I'm seeing in your current proposed bill, that there is a funding mechanism, programs, services, and considerations. Truly, it's not every day when I go into states and I work with legislators and regulators and industry stakeholders that I see something this comprehensive in considering the potential harms. And the second finding from the Engage survey is that actually the rates of problematic gambling behavior is 2 to 3 times that of other forms of gambling. So I'm not comparing it to non-gamblers, I'm comparing it to other forms of gambling here. And they answered in the affirmative to things like, I need to gamble more for the same amount of excitement that I used to have at a lesser amount. Or, oh, now I'm starting to rely on others. Maybe that's through the utilization of credit cards even, which I see you also speak to in the bill. Or perhaps I've lied at twice the rate about my gambling or participation comparative to other gamblers. So as we see it, you're talking about a specific demographic that is more inclined to engage in problematic play. And also, it's a different demographic than we've traditionally spoken to as it relates to vulnerabilities. So Keith and I would have been inclined to talk about your young Black males. Maybe we'd be talking about lower socioeconomic status or someone who doesn't have higher degrees of education as being traditionally vulnerable. We've actually seen the opposite with sports wagering. I'm starting to see populations where we're talking about the young, white, affluent, well-educated male finding themselves very captivated by this product, struggling. So really, it's taking a product, it's normalizing it through the culture, and now all of a sudden demographics that, as Dr. Whelan pointed out, have been traditionally not really had robust prevention and other programs tied to initiatives. Now we're talking about a whole new one that really we've not learned how to articulate our concerns for prevention. So also we see women. Women are now changing the game, so to speak, as it relates to sports wagering. We know women are often first drivers in developing and utilizing technology and the phones. And so they too could also now be considered a vulnerable demographic. Moving along, I don't want to belabor the point. Funding, you do a nice job. Tennessee has designated 5% of the tax revenue. Virginia, 2.5%. If I recall, you're at 2.5% with no less than 250,000. We would consider this a best practice. I think it would be astute to have an understanding that as the market matures, your needs may so too increase, similar to that of Colorado. And so it might be paramount to have some revisiting of the issue within a year's time, maybe 3 years' time, to ensure that you're adequately funding the programs you need. You do speak to the helpline within the legislation. Unfortunately, I think it's a little vague. Things that we're hearing from both operators, best practices in the problem gambling community, and consumers alike is that if you're in crisis, you're needing very direct, clear information. And right now, there's such a fractured approach to helplines. In fact, we've got well over 25 across the US, leaving most advertisements with helpline in about size 3 font at the very bottom. And imagine if you're an individual who really needs help and you're ready to take that step. I don't think any of us would think that that person would be in a place to have to go and search for which helpline is appropriate for them. So I would urge you to consider making it the national helpline. This helps streamline the font size, the services, the information being conveyed by your operators, and it will, in fact, direct someone who's in need in Vermont to local resources. And Keith might be speaking more to the way that the helpline is structured, but I want you to see on the presentation how important having a helpline is and having it prominently displayed. Connecticut calls increased significantly, over 300% to the helpline after sports wagering went live. Virginia saw a spike. Problem gambling helpline calls in Pennsylvania skewed younger and doubled in 2021. Colorado and Michigan cited a 44% increase in helpline calls after sports wagering went live. Again, making sure that the helpline is standardized, it's prominent, and that there is someone to answer and direct someone to services is really key. I also noted that you have an annual research agenda. It may not be as comprehensive as I've seen in the likes of Massachusetts or Maryland, but I do think having an annual research agenda to really understand better not only the prevalence rate of problem gambling, but also how legalization has changed those incident rates of harm. Looking at those 3 brackets that Dr. Whelan talked about is really key. And it's really key to have that reporting mechanism so you can decide which policies are best to be deploying, whether it be in a regulations or whether you need a new statute. I'd like to highlight that while I agree with Dr. Whelan saying the average of the 1% to 2% baseline for prevalence is in many cases, but an annual research agenda in the likes of Illinois and New Jersey has highlighted that actually, in fact, they don't fall within that 1% to 2%. In fact, Illinois recently published in 2022 a report that found that 3.8% of their adult population has a gambling addiction, and another 9% is considered to be significantly at risk. I mean, that leaves about 14% of the Illinois adult population struggling. And New Jersey's been struggling with this for years. It's a reason they are doing a massive overhaul in their responsible gaming approaches. Their incident rates or prevalence is hovering over 6%. That's 3 times the national average. So while Dr. Whelan is right, the average seems to be about 1% to 2%. Having an annual research agenda as part of your overall commitment will ensure that Vermont stays and is doing everything it can to make sure that those rates are as low as possible. We've heard this from Dean as well as Dr. Whelan, mandating education. We recently saw Virginia pass a law about this. As I noted, this is about to become pervasive and normalized within the culture. I have an 8-year-old who's asked me about some of the apps and what is it and can we get it, right? And our children grow up understanding that there's no such thing as a risk-free drink, right? Drinking alcohol comes with risks. There's no such thing as a risk-free puff of a cigarette. If you have unprotected sex, these are the consequences. But how many adults, let alone children, understand that engaging in gambling comes with risks and that it also has an addictive quality about it? It is really imperative that as we put a new product into the general population, this isn't your mother's gambling, right? This is not getting in a car and going to a casino or buying a lottery ticket. This is something that is on these phones. We so too need to be educating people about what it means and how to stay safe. And that's really where responsible gambling, I think, comes in. It's the policies and programs that need to help curb and prevent problems from happening. Dr. Whelan talked about the main components he sees for a program. I talk about it in 4 brackets. I talk about the necessity of research to really assess and evaluate where you're at. I talk about prevention. This would be inclusive of responsible gaming and awareness campaigns. And then there's treatment, and then there's recovery. So like I said, Keith's going to talk more about the treatment component. The first tenets of responsible gambling I had advised was that there's a written plan that's mandated as part of licensure. You have that. You were ahead of the game. This bill accounts for that. Having a training component for all the staff. You heard Dean speak to the fact that he has RG ambassadors, and that's terrific. And we love to see Caesars doing that. But the truth of the matter is there are plenty of operators out there who aren't yet doing that. So having that as part of the statute and the regulations is key, because the market is only as strong as the weakest actor. And standardizing the expectations done in conjunction with experts like your Department of Mental Health is going to ensure that everybody is trained at the same level. Going on about other, I saw in the statute things that were talking about information on responsible gambling. That's great, but I think it could become standardized and teased out a little bit more. Back to the Reno model. What are we talking about? Practical tips on how to keep gambling safe. You know, it's wonderful to see things like a requirement to offer limits, but it really is coming down to how prominent are they? Are they 10 clicks away, or are they right there and being offered to me at the time that I register? How often am I being presented as a consumer with these opportunities? How often am I getting reminders? I think that brings me to the push notifications. I know I had spoken about that the last time I presented. It's wonderful. But my fear is that even if you only have 2 operators, I see that there's a 2 to 6 potential variants. It would be really important to have customers getting streamlined information and expectations. I'd hate to see one operator giving a notification, you've been on my app 30 minutes, and another one say it's been 7 hours. Having that kind of very specificity and guidance is going to ensure consumers know exactly what they're getting, and also help you better evaluate its efficacy in trying to get consumers to use these mitigation tools. RG tools exist to try and curb rates of addiction or problems. So if we streamline it and standardize it, this will better help achieve your goals. As part of the sports betting legalization, I think Connecticut, as well as Ohio, have really done a tremendous job of setting expectations about the transparency that consumers really should be entitled to when they play on these apps. It's very easy to get carried away. I myself can get carried away and playing around with them, even if I'm not wagering. And I know the dangers of it, right? So I think that I've put links to both of their regulations as well as their statutes in my presentation. I think they are worth noting. Nobody's really talked about advertising yet, and I think it's kind of the elephant in the room. It's never an easy one. There's been a lot of scrutiny around this. Again, Colorado did an entire bill surrounding their concerns on advertising. We have seen other states subsequently go back and file cleanup bills because they're concerned around not only the amount of advertising, but the content of advertising. So I'd like to highlight some of the considerations. I see that you have noted that it'd be important to not have celebrities that are targeting underage, someone who is of underage. Your neighbor in Maine is actually considering the banning altogether of celebrity endorsements. If Maine were to pass their regulations, they'd be probably the most restrictive we've seen in the US. Ohio has also been very aggressive from the start in noting their expectations in the font size and presentation of problem and responsible gambling messaging. It's a really important consideration. Not only that, there's this terminology that's very common within the industry called risk-free bets. From a public health aspect, we don't believe there's ever anything such as risk-free, whether or not I'll lose my money or not. I think Keith will get into this. But the reality is we would urge you to consider really examining what is and is not appropriate. I did include on the presentation, I won't belabor it, the 2 states that have really had to go back and examine this issue after legalization and what that looks like. Similar to Dean, although I believe self-exclusion belongs in problem gambling, I believe you use a cool-off or a timeout, which I see included in your bill, although I'd like to see that more clearly defined. What are the standardized offerings? Having a centralized, streamlined approach to timeouts, cool-offs, and self-exclusions is paramount. We want to ensure that people have a way that they can exclude themselves if this is not an appropriate product. Just to put on everyone's radar, there's starting to become more of an interest in states buying or subsidizing blocking software as part of their self-exclusion programs as a way to offer individuals an extra guardrail to keep protected. Basically, these blocking softwares make it where you can't access your apps or any sites for anything that's gambling, both legal market or not. Just wanted you to have that information. I think that's really covered everything. My last slide is about payments. We would encourage that it's not just about self-exclusion from being able to wager, but that people should have the ability to exclude from certain types of payments. So I really should be able to have the ability to say, I'd not like to gamble on my credit card or my debit card or particular e-wallet anytime I'm in a platform. And while I know you have a proposed outright ban on credit cards, I think maybe taking it a step further would be a true best practice in an exclusion program as it relates to payments. With that, I appreciate your time, your consideration. I hope that the presentation is helpful and I haven't been too redundant, and I'd welcome any questions from the committee.
You have brought up a number of things. I have taken copious notes. No, I really, really appreciate it. That's by way of saying I really appreciate your presentation and all the sample language from other states for us to consider. Do folks have clarifying questions? I want to make sure we have time to get to Dr. Klein, but if there are folks who have clarifying questions, Representative Hooper, excuse me.
Brianne, can you explain more about blocking software and how that works?
Sure. So often these are standalone apps. Some can be for purchase, some are charities. I'm not going to be promoting any individual, but these softwares basically get downloaded on your phone and you can select a particular duration of time. Best practice would be it should basically copy what your cool off or timeout. So let's say I've decided I need to take a break for 3 months. I would upload this app. I would select, I'm going to block myself from 3 months. And then anytime I went to go click on any of my sports wagering apps or even go onto a site, it would block me. I couldn't get on it. Even black market, gray market, anything, like it would be a total block of anything gambling or gaming like related.
And that's a self-exclusion. That's something somebody would impose on themselves as the consumer.
That's exactly right. But we're seeing states like Ohio, for instance, they have decided that at the time someone self-excludes through the state, they're going to be offering a subscription for blocking software that if they so choose that they can deploy onto their devices as an extra guardrail. Now, the truth of the matter is all of the operators have their own internal controls to be auditing daily if someone who is self-excluded is trying to access the app, and having a self-report and all those internal controls constantly talking with the regulator is really also key for transparency. But from a consumer side, individuals who are in recovery have often spoken to the comfort they have knowing that there is just a little bit extra of a barrier that exists on their devices if temptation were to ever strike. I mean, imagine taking that step and then you're out for drinks with the guys at the bar and all of a sudden they're all wagering. I imagine that temptation's a little bit more pronounced. But if your phone doesn't let you get on, no matter how many drinks you've had, they know that it's not bulletproof. Things happen, there are workarounds, but I just wanted you to know this is a new trend I am seeing amongst policymakers as it relates to best practices and exclusion.
Well, thank you for your testimony. And if you'd like to stay on, I would invite you to do that. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Klein to come up and take the chair. Thanks for being with us today.
For having me.
Would you introduce yourself for the record and tell us your thoughts and feedback on H127?
Yes, absolutely. So my name is Dr. Kelly Klein. I am a board certified psychiatrist and a physician board certified in addiction medicine as well. And I'm the current medical director for the Vermont Department of Mental Health. And first, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak to the legalization of online sports betting from a mental health lens and a clinical lens. The Department of Mental Health is very grateful to be part of these initial conversations, and we're very dedicated to creating an infrastructure to support Vermonters who will and are experiencing problem gambling. So as you all know, we do not have any brick and mortar casinos in Vermont, and I'm going to speak a little bit more from a Vermont lens. The only current access that Vermonters have to gambling right now is through the Vermont Lottery. Accessing legal online betting through neighboring states, or in some cases, accessing online sports betting through illegal means. The legalization of online sports betting will bring gambling mainstream within Vermont, and many more individuals will participate. For example, in New York State, where this was legalized last year, there were 3.8 million new signups, meaning all individuals who were not accessing online sports betting in neighboring states or through illegal means. To put this in context, we are a much smaller population. So in Vermont, the equivalent would be 140,000 new signups. So still substantial. In order to provide appropriate services, it's necessary to understand the potential impacts and the data associated with online sports betting specifically. So from mental health and clinical lens, online sports betting has a high addiction potential. In a recent study by Ohio, exposure to traditional gambling, so casinos, retail sports betting, 1 in 10 individuals will develop problem gambling. Exposed to online sports betting, 1 in 4 will develop problem gambling. Both forms of gambling have intermittent reward, which is both addictive and very difficult to extinguish when a behavior is established. Online sports betting differs in that there are minimal barriers to access. This is accessible 24/7 from a smartphone, like others have said. There are less cultural barriers, that's already been spoken to as well. As online sports betting has taken the nation by storm, you'd be really hard pressed to find a sportscaster that doesn't talk about certain platforms throughout their cast. Most striking, though, is the number of times one can bet and therefore experience reward throughout a single game. This is not traditional betting where you pick a square for the final score. You can bet on hundreds of specific moves, specific scores throughout a single game. So this triggers the reward pathway potentially hundreds of times in one single game. Which brings us to the fact that those in the college population are at a very high risk for problem gambling, with 62% of those that engage regularly in online sports betting, and they define that as once per week, meeting criteria for problem gambling. Problem gambling, I'm just going to define it.
Ask you to restate, repeat that last.
Yes, so those in the college population are at a high risk for problem gambling, with 62% of those that engage in online sports betting regularly, meaning at least once per week. That's what they define as regular. 62% of those individuals meet the criteria for problem gambling. It's a very high percentage.
That's 62% of college folks
Yep.
who engage at least once a week.
Correct.
Meet the definition of
Problem gambling.
gambling.
Yep. And I'm going to define that for you. Problem gambling is defined as persistent or recurrent problematic gambling behavior leading to significant impairment or distress. This can include, as others have stated, increased need to gamble with increasing amounts of money in order to achieve desired excitement, making or being restless or irritable when trying to cut down on gambling, making repeated unsuccessful attempts at trying to cut down, control, or stopping, being preoccupied with gambling, gambling when feeling distressed, chasing losses, lying to conceal the extent of involvement with gambling, jeopardizing or losing significant relationship, job, or educational or career opportunities because of gambling, and relying on others to provide money to relieve desperate financial situations caused by gambling. The health implications associated with this can include increased rates of depression, substance use, anxiety, increased utilization of healthcare services, And of most concern, studies have found up to a 15 times increased risk of suicide mortality as compared to the general population. So with that in mind, we must go into this with our eyes open and the knowledge that although this will be a fun recreation for the majority of individuals, there will be Vermonters who will have problem gambling, and we must be prepared to support them. With the knowledge of potential addiction, we have a unique opportunity in Vermont to create a robust, accessible, and shame-reducing infrastructure for supporting those with problem gambling. To appropriately serve this population, others have spoken to this as well, Vermont will need public health awareness and promotion, a helpline for the training of therapists throughout the state, and funding for therapist time to continue to provide cost-free treatment. Department of Liquor and Lottery currently does have a grant that is awarded to the Howard Center, which provides for part of one clinician who provides cost-free treatment and limited public messaging. These funds and resources were developed for the Vermont Lottery. Although we do not know the specific costs yet for a sports betting problem gambling program, we do know that we will need to develop a more robust infrastructure than what we currently have. The minimum funds allocated for this should reflect the increased engagement that will be required to support the increased need. Additionally, developing and implementing infrastructure will take time. In addition to infrastructure for support, we need to ensure that responsible gaming measures are put in place to mitigate problem gambling risk. Responsible gaming measures are not foolproof mental health protections. However, they can establish guardrails that assist the state in limiting problem gambling practices. The Department of Mental Health has and will work with other partners to develop a set of recommendations aimed to address issues such as underage betting, identity theft, and problem gambling practices. Thank you so much for your time, and I welcome any questions.
Representative Higley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I heard you say that there was maybe some federal funding for a part-time position as a therapist for some help. Is
The
that
Department of Liquor and Lottery through Vermont.
all through Vermont? Now, is there some other money that brings that to a full-time position?
Not currently.
Okay, thank you.
So,
And that is for the whole state.
so to follow up on Representative Higley's question, I mean, what currently, let's set aside the gaming special fund that's in the bill, but what are we currently investing in problem gambling resources in the state of Vermont right now?
That is the fund.
That's it.
That is it right now, currently. And that was developed for the Vermont Lottery, which obviously has a smaller population of problem gambling than what we will be looking at.
Representative Hooper.
So this is one part-time individual. And with how many patients does that individual interact? You know?
I do not know the specific number on it. I know it's underutilized currently. And part of that is the limited messaging that's available currently. And also it's a very shame-inducing condition. People have a very difficult time reaching out for help. And in Vermont, we really want to flip that script, that we know this can be an addiction and we're here to help.
So Dr. Klein, in the spirit of full disclosure, my spouse is in the mental health field, and I'm thinking, I've never heard her really talk about problem gambling as an area of focus. Are there clinicians that are focused on this, like in the private sector, that aren't funded by the state of Vermont? But
Yes, there are, definitely. And it does depend. The prevalence of gambling disorders is directly related to exposure. So there are going to be less currently in Vermont than you might see elsewhere because we don't have as much exposure. We don't have the brick and mortar casinos. We have the lottery, but that is really all that we have currently. So as we expand, we will see this market expand for the need for mental health care as well. The Carter Institute in Vermont also does specialize in gambling. That's in the private sector though.
Representative Morowicki and then Representative Byron.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah,
Have you been here for all the testimony?
I have.
Okay, thanks. I believe I heard some previous testimonies suggested that we might tighten up the draft of this bill in regards to funding this. Is that something you would agree with?
Yes, I would. I can't speak to specifics of it. We have not come up with a specific number, but we are working on it.
Thanks.
Representative Byron.
No, thank you very much. That was really in-depth testimony that you gave. And with that, I was curious if you have that on copy, could it be shared with the committee assistant so we can put it on our page for reference later?
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Great. Well, Dr. Klein, would you, if you'd like to stay with us, if you're done your testimony, are there any other questions for Dr. Klein at this point? I imagine as we try to develop some of the recommendations and consider the language, we might ask you to come back and join us.
Anytime.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So Keith White is our last witness on the list for this topic today. So Keith, welcome to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. Thanks for being with us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. Batting cleanup is great because you've assembled such a fantastic roster of witnesses. I've just been editing my remarks just to try and amplify a couple key points, and certainly I'll be available for questions later. So I'm here today to speak on behalf of the National Council on Problem Gambling, the sole national advocate for problem gamblers and their loved ones, to provide testimony and answer questions primarily about, I think, creating a publicly funded support system as the bill contemplates within the Department of Mental Health. We've already covered responsible gambling extensively and some problem gambling bits as well. So like I said, I'll highlight a few things and then be ready for questions. Our mission is to lead state and national stakeholders in the development of comprehensive policy and programs to mitigate the suffering of all those affected by gambling problems. There are an estimated 7 million Americans, including around 12,000 adults in Vermont who meet criteria for gambling problems in a given year. Our vision is to improve the health and wellness of not just those individuals, but the entire state by reducing the personal, social, and economic costs of problem gambling. Very importantly, NCPG is neutral, neither for nor against legalized gambling. I think everyone agrees that a hasty sports betting rollout without sufficient time and funding to build a comprehensive problem gambling program will increase the rate and severity of gambling problems that stem from the expansion of legalized gambling. Very briefly, the key elements of a comprehensive program to address problem gambling are prevention, education, treatment, enforcement, research, responsible gambling, and recovery, or PETER. Sorry, it's not a great acronym, but they're similar in scale and scope, though, to public health efforts to mitigate harm from substance use and abuse. So we're thinking statewide, from an individual to a family level, to a community, to all the way up to a statewide level, and even again, a national level. And while time doesn't prevent me to address each of these elements in detail, as discussed, and to our knowledge, Vermont does not have more than minimal gambling addiction prevention programs in place to protect youth, nor are there significant public awareness or targeted educational efforts to reduce harm among those adults who gamble already. And just as a side note, while Dr. Klein is absolutely right that bringing online sports betting to Vermont will increase exposure, our surveys show that roughly 75% of Vermonters have already gambled in the past year. So while you may get to 80%, what you're really talking about, quite frankly, is shifting. So, within that 75 to 80% of Vermonters who gamble, you're going to get a lot more people who will now bet on online sports. But that doesn't mean they're going to stop betting the lottery or stop visiting casinos, So it's important to think of this, when you think of expansion, you're looking at increasing participation in various sectors and perhaps shifting a little bit, but primarily these are people who are already gambling. You're just perhaps increasing the risk and shifting them from one form to another, or adding additional forms of gambling, I guess it's better to say. As we just recently talked about, publicly funded treatment appears to consist of one part-time clinician and perhaps some folks in the private sector. Unfortunately, most insurance companies routinely deny reimbursement for a diagnosis of pathological gambling. As Dr. Klein said, there's enormous shame and stigma, and even very good mental health parity laws like Vermont's do not specifically include problem gambling as an issue. Americans with Disabilities Act actually specifically excludes pathological gambling from a diagnosis. So there are many, many barriers in the private sector, and there are many, many barriers in the public sector. it's no surprise that treatment utilization is low, as Dr. Klein said, because the efforts are rarely advertised. But also, for the entire history of Vermont, you've been telling people, if you have a gambling problem, don't come to the state. This is not something we do. Insurance companies have said the same thing. So even if you build it, they won't necessarily come. And that's just really important to keep in mind when you look at existing treatment utilization. If you have a weakly funded and frankly pretty rudimentary system, it's no surprise there's low usage. And that even if you bootstrap it up quite rapidly, you probably will not see rapid growth. They're there. They've just been told for their entire lifetime that this is not something that you can get help for in Vermont. So it will take a while to overcome that resistance. Just to pick up on the Peter thing again, enforcement of gambling laws is very important, both to cut down the illegal market and also ensure that operators are held to high standards, especially when sports betting is introduced. What we've seen in state after state is within the first month of sports betting, for example, in Ohio, millions of dollars of fines levied to operators and marketing affiliates who didn't comply with the responsible gambling guidelines, even after initial warnings. There is enormous incentive for operators to try and seize as much of the market share as possible, sometimes, unfortunately, at the cost of their responsible gambling commitments. And we would urge the legislator to keep that in mind when you're expanding sports betting. Responsible gambling is important.
Ask a clarifying question on that really quickly? Is that because they were essentially trying to be more competitive in terms of what their costs were, and so, or increase the revenue share with the states?
It is unclear. It seems to stem sometimes from the newness of the particular thing in a state, although most of these companies have been operating sports betting for years. Some of it is that the responsible gambling advertising requirements do differ by state, but a lot of it just simply seems to be a lack of serious commitment to responsible gambling. And especially amongst third-party providers. The operator itself may have that commitment, but by the time they hire a marketing affiliate who makes their money by recruiting gamblers, and then by the time that marketing affiliate places an ad in a newspaper, the responsible gambling ad may be in 1-point font, or the number may be left off altogether. And we've seen this time and time and again. I don't think it's intentional, but it is absolutely at this point, a feature of the bonanza of ads you get that Brianne referred to, post in that huge rush post expansion to saturate the state and get as many people to gamble on your platform versus someone else's platform.
Representative Chase had a question.
Please. Yes, sir.
Yeah, is there earlier we were talking about the penalties for breaking these rules. Is there a best practice that you've come across as far as making the risk equivalent to the reward, so there's less incentive to jump in and, okay, I'll pay the $10,000 fine, but I get 80% of the market?
Clearly, yeah, you've been watching the news. I do think the fines are massively disproportionate. I think New Jersey, it's around a couple $1,000s per violation. And that is clearly a slap on the wrist at best for a multi-billion-dollar company. Ohio, I think now in the first 2 weeks of sports betting has levied more fines than were assessed in every other state over the past year. So I think I do think part of compliance is that pain. And I think right now, most of the fines do not appear to be truly ensuring compliance. I think post-Ohio and hopefully post-Vermont, I think compliance will be a lot more serious, taken a lot more seriously.
Thank you.
Yeah, these are great questions. And again, I'm just going to highlight a few things, but please, we're here to help you as you work through this process. Yeah, as we noted, the Vermont Lottery does do responsible gambling, and we appreciate and congratulate them. The services that they help fund, the usage is extraordinarily low. And on research, we're not aware of any research to measure the baseline rate of gambling problems among Vermont citizens, if those problems are already increasing. As Brianne mentioned, there's some evidence that states with aggressive sports betting and online sports betting operations have higher base rates of gambling problems. And as Jim noted, it traditionally, once you've expanded casinos, there is that initial surge of problems, and then it may dip after a few years. I think part of that dip is, as Gamblers Anonymous would say, people who are unavailable to be counted because they are at the gates of prison, insanity, or death. That's a quote from the GA Yellow Book. So some of that decline may be due to normalization, but some of that decline is due to people that are no longer there to be counted because their gambling problems have become so severe. And I think all of us agree that the important point is to try and mitigate on the front side, rather than hoping that sports betting will be like other forms of gambling and that will have a lot more problems, but then they will return to a low base rate. There's no guarantee that sports betting will behave like other verticals in the gambling industry. So if Vermont is building a comprehensive problem gambling system from scratch, as Dr. Klein said, it's important for two reasons. One, you already have an existing rate of problems. And two, sports betting is associated with higher rates of gambling problems. And as discussed, there are certain populations may be particularly vulnerable. We talked a little bit about college students, and I think that's important, but let's add to that list adolescents, males, we talked about gender a little bit, athletes, veterans, and active duty military personnel all have, in general survey research, at least twice the rate of gambling problems. And many of those are highly attuned to sports betting. Gambling problems are also highly co-occurring with other disorders. They're strongly associated with substance use and abuse, depression, and suicidal behaviors. And so let me just wrap up and say the important recommendations of the Sports Betting Study Committee contain excellent recommendations on the responsible gambling provisions. They are aligned with our Safer Sports Betting initiative, best practices like our Internet Responsible Gambling Standards. I think Dean, Jim, and Brianne and I all agree on the RG side, you've done an excellent job. We commend you for that work. And those provisions that were incorporated into H127, we think are very solid. However, the bill provides a lot less detail on the problem gambling programs, and that's where I focus the majority of my remarks today. In working with the Division of Mental Health, we believe they have an imperative, and hopefully a legislative imperative, to develop a comprehensive problem gambling program to match the best practices you have on the RG side, in conjunction with other agencies and stakeholders, incorporating at a minimum the aforementioned PETER elements. Just a few other quick notes. We agree with Dean and strongly support that the minimum age for sports betting be 21. I'm sorry, not 18 as proposed in the bill. As we've mentioned, risk-free ads. We believe gambling, by definition, is never risk-free. So this language is not appropriate when applied to sports betting or any other form of gambling promotions. I want to agree with Dean and emphasize that there should be a statewide self-exclusion list. Whether it's regulated by the regulator or the Division of Mental Health is up to you. We've seen it done both ways. But that statewide list should cover all forms of legal gambling in the state, including daily fantasy, to make sure that players have one-stop shopping, that there are fewer barriers to exclude. Funding has come up a few times, and obviously that's very important. We do recommend that the percentage of the tax revenue from sports betting be used to fund problem gambling programs administered by DMH. We endorse the proposed levels in H127, especially because the percentage matches best practice amongst the states, but you also have a floor. All too often we see if there's only a percentage, if there's a bad quarter or things like the recent pandemic, the problem gambling programs get hollowed out. So having that floor in there is best practice, and we think that's very good. However, because there's no current existing infrastructure, and because the sports betting tax revenue will not be realized for some time after sports betting goes live in the state, and players have problems now and will develop them prior to the sports tax gambling revenue wending its way back to DMH. We recommend, as they did in Massachusetts, that the state immediately provide the equivalent of 1 year's estimated problem gambling tax funding in seed money to the Department of Mental Health to ensure they can begin creating these programs before the problems start to spike. So just to say, without this infrastructure in place, it makes legalizing sports betting in Vermont a little bit more of a risky proposition than it should be. But we believe that with proper funding and effective program management, the state can take a substantial step in creating a safer and more sustainable gambling environment overall for its residents, certainly including if you choose to expand sports betting. Programs to prevent and treat gambling addiction are the most ethical and effective way to balance the costs and benefits of legalized gambling. We estimate that every dollar spent to prevent and treat gambling problems saves at least $2, saves the state at least $2 in related criminal justice and healthcare costs. And again, if you have any recommendations, please feel free to let us know. We're happy to be here to help you. Thank you again very much for the opportunity to testify before you today.
Representative Hooper.
Thank you, Keith. You mentioned athletes as a demographic category of victims of addiction in this regard. Do we have a metric for how many athletes actually rig their own contests?
So, not surprisingly, most of the leagues don't want to talk to us about this. We believe they've done some efforts amongst their own players, and they're heavily investing in education and education efforts amongst their players. The information, the evidence we do have comes from a survey done by the National Collegiate Athletic Association every 3 years of roughly 25,000 student athletes. It's done by NCAA itself, so we think there's some underreporting, but the amount of the number of athletes who report match fixing behavior is below 1%, but it's somewhere around like 0.4, I think. When you look at the number of athletes who self-report they violated NCAA's gambling rules, roughly 30%. And I suspect most athletes are not going to report to the NCAA itself that they have thrown a game. So it's probably somewhere between that 30% and that 0.4. You also, for our purposes, if you look at the number of athletes who self-report criteria for significant gambling problems, that's much higher than that 0.4%. And we believe that an athlete, not just a player, but someone who's associated, a student manager, referees, even coaches, if they have a gambling problem, they are much more likely to be at risk to fix or throw a game. So we don't have a precise answer to your question, but it is a significant area of concern, not just in amateur athletics, of course, but in professional athletics as well.
Representative Chase, and I do want to acknowledge that we're running a little over time, and the auditor has the completion of our testimony from yesterday that everyone can give us a few minutes and then we'll get to the auditor. So a couple more questions and then we'll have to break on this for today.
Sure. You mentioned the exclusion list being statewide instead of per platform. Do you see merit in there being both options, like one or the other? Because maybe an individual has a problem with a particular platform style, but other ones they can use more responsibly? Or is there a hard recommendation that it should be completely blanket?
I think as long as there's a statewide system, allowing individuals choice within that system makes a lot of sense. So we even recommend in our Internet Responsible Gambling Standards, patrons be allowed to bar themselves from one form of vertical on a platform, but not another. So if you've really got a problem with poker, but you feel like you're still a sports bettor, that should be up to the individual. So yes, I think having the system work statewide is the important part. Most states do not allow individuals to opt out of a platform. I think in theory that if you've got a problem, you've got a problem, but there is a middle ground within that player autonomy.
Thank you.
I imagine this is not going to be our final conversation here. Representative Hooper, the last question, and then we'll break on this.
This is a question for anybody who can answer it. I'm curious to explore whether or not we could build into the law this blocking software requirement for apps to include. I think Caesars was the one that said we block out participants who are overdoing it. Is that correct?
Yeah. I think your question's apt, and I think we think about this. It's a multi-layered safety net, right? So operators have to have their own policies and procedures as they would under H127. The state should have a statewide system, prevention, education, treatment, enforcement, research. So and then allowing, encouraging, or even facilitating the usage of software apps is a further layer. So some states or some companies will subsidize subscription fee. The state could do that. You could ask operators to do that. There's a lot of ways to get there, because some of the, as Brianne said, some of these apps have a monthly subscription, some of them are free. But I think the important point is, if someone's struggling with a gambling problem, you want to give them as many tools, as many pathways to mitigate their harm as you can. And blocking software is really important also because you can only bind the operators in the state of Vermont. It would be very easy for someone who has a gambling problem to then cross the border and play on someone else's platform or play on an illegal site. And that's one of the great advantages of blocking software. They continually scrub the internet to try and get every single URL associated with a gambling site. It's a constant game of cat and mouse, but the blocking software itself is not adequate. But when it's layered with lots of other protections, it will help eliminate some of that leakage.
Well, Keith, thank you for being with us today. We have a lot to think about and a few examples of policy areas we might consider delving into and making updates to the next draft of the bill. So I really appreciate you all sharing your thoughts with us today, and we'll pick this back up in the next couple of days and take a little bit more testimony, and I think include some of the recommendations here in the next draft of the bill. So this was very, very helpful, and I appreciate you all being with us today.
Thank you very much. You're on the right path as you think about this. You've done a lot of good work, and we appreciate the thoroughness. So thank you. Let us know anything we can do to help.
Thanks. So committee, would folks like to take just a very brief break? Okay, so I would like everybody to come back in 5, if that's okay, so that we